we are now the sixth largest defense company by market cap, but we have 3,800 employees compared to hundreds of thousands for the other 5 or so companies, right? So software is not going to look like the other traditional businesses. It's not going to be a hire for mass sort of play. You're really hiring for exquisite skills. Software requires a sort of culture. Again, a culture that is unique to America, but as it doesn't exist everywhere in America. You have to inculcate it within the companies. And I think you can see that transformation even with Tesla, where they spend more on software R&D than they do on hardware R&D. So when I look at the present moment, we're no longer the best at mass production, but we are the best at software by a yawning margin. Somehow we kind of forget that there are 0 Chinese enterprise software companies that are competitive on the world stage. There are 0 Indian enterprise software companies competitive on the world stage. There is clearly something more than just raw IQ about getting software to work at scale. It's cultural. And that culture exists at scale only in America. So this is a unique advantage we have. And I think we can see how software, Andreessen has talked about how software eats the world. Well, software ate the car. People laughed at Tesla until they realized actually Tesla made a software-defined vehicle. The old truism that the moment you drive your car off the lot, it depreciates by 10%. It's not so true with the Tesla, actually. This car is continuously getting updated, and we saw that reflected in resale values. So somehow software is breaking all the rules. And I think we need to honor the fact that we're the world's best at it. It allows us to redefine the rules that are in favor of the West, in favor of freedom and prosperity. I don't want to be too reductionist about it, but I think what's really important is this elegant integration of the humans that we have with software. We can almost better think of all of this software as an Iron Man suit for the humans who do the job. As Colonel Boyd said, terrain doesn't fight wars, machines don't fight wars, humans do. And the OODA loop that he pioneered, observe, orient, decide, act, that's where I see the greatest leverage coming from software. It's not about the data, it's about the decisions. And so it's about wielding software to achieve decision advantage. Now, when you frame it that way, you recognize, of course, the concept of JADC2 makes sense, right? It's how do you integrate all of your sensors, all of your shooters to capture that decision advantage or information dominance? That's fundamentally a software problem. It's not a hardware problem. And then that allows you to replan how you're going to approach these things. I think that presents us with enormous numbers of challenges. The first amongst which is, are we even organized for a world that looks like that? There's this old saying in Silicon Valley that there's the first 80% and the second 80%. And, because people kind of trivialize whichever end of the problem they don't end up owning as the easy part. And I think this has really happened. It's not unique to government, actually. It's happened in the commercial world where people kind of cargo cult various architectures or technologies. Like, this is the approach. If I just buy this widget or this box, it means I've done the right thing. And of course, the cargo cult I've realized this is not a totally well understood reference, but it's a reference to the Melanesians in the South Pacific who, during World War II, when they saw US troops marching around or using hand signals or building air traffic control towers, these amazing steel beasts would land with Coca-Cola and radios and amazing futuristic technologies. So then one day the steel beasts stopped arriving. So they started to do what they saw US service members doing. They dressed up in fatigues. They marched with sticks, whittled down to resemble rifles. They built fake airfields. They cleared the ground. But of course, the steel planes never returned, right? So there's a way in which we have lost the fundamental connection to how to use technology to achieve advantage. And so that now comes back to your question, like, yes, manpower matters, munition matters, production matters. The question is how you wield your software to drive those decisions. Readiness is something you can achieve. It's a problem to be managed every day, not a problem to be solved. And so where do you spend your limited time and attention to achieve the projection of force that you need across manning, equipping, and training people? How do you reflect that into the industrial base so that you have some connection from the foxhole to the factory floor? How do you create more levers that you can pull on? And so being able to have that visibility at the point of decision-making is absolutely massive. That is information dominance, and cascading that as you keep going. So I think that's the pragmatic implication of this. It's not the killer drones. It's not Skynet. It's actually being able to see yourself much better and understand and simulate the consequences of every decision you're going to make so you don't have regret. When we first started, really, we wanted to solve a handful of problems related to counterterrorism for a handful of institutions in the world. And we had taken this approach that we pioneered at PayPal to fight fraud, which was PayPal's existential problem, to send money back and forth online. It's really hard to do that without being defrauded by the Russian mob. And so that was the critical insight. How do you solve that? That essentially I would summarize as kind of like having an Iron Man suit for the humans. Humans are quite special, actually. So how do you project their intuitions and scale it to a phenomenon where you don't have a large N of prior occurrences, just like CT? But what we realized when we started engaging with the government is that unlike a company like PayPal, that's essentially a modern institution that had all of its data structured and integrated, the hard problem in government started first there, that you had systems that were written 40 years ago, right next to systems written 40 minutes ago that were eye-watering in how exquisite they are. But the challenge was, how do you get all of this information to integrate across this so that you can make a decision, so that you can proverbially connect the dots? And of course, how do you do that securely? How do you do that respecting classification? How do you govern that stuff? The founding impetus for us was not just, hey, we want to prevent terrorism. Of course we do. We also want to prevent the reaction to terrorism, which is often a kind of shift to reduce civil liberties, to give up privacy in the name of achieving security. But our experience kind of taught us that we were more likely to end up in a world where you had both less privacy and less security. And that's a unique role that we cannot, the technologists have to show up and deliver that. Now, that was kind of our feeling in this world where, by and large, at that time, no one in the Valley was interested in working with government at all. And I'd say at that time, it was actually for more pedestrian reasons. If we went to 2006, it would be like, well, it's impossible to build a business with the government. It's not even a political objection. That kind of came later, a decade or so following that. But now, of course, and if we transition to great power competition, I think one of the things that happened in the intervening time, so as we worked on counterterrorism, we were also building a commercial business. So mid-market manufacturers all the way to the largest companies in the world, helping them build things, helping them manage their production, their supply chain, quality, how they monitor the equipment they build once they put it into service, everything that connects them from their suppliers to their customers. And when we look at this, so it gives us a deep perspective into production, the industrial base in the broad sense, not just defense industrial base, but the industrial base, and how this stuff is working today. And a huge amount of conviction that there is a big opportunity to catalyze the reindustrialization of America, leveraging our greatest strength, which is software, ours and the nation's greatest strength. And I call that software-defined production. I think in many ways, the modern manufacturers have kind of shown that, whether it's scaled companies like Tesla or new entrants and challengers like Hadrian, who are building autonomous factories. There's clearly a way of doing this that allows us to drive prosperity and the reindustrialization that maybe is a consequence of the flawed industrial policy starting in the 90s, but to do so in a way that also promotes freedom and prosperity and deters future conflict. But actually, the majority of the work is still in front of us. So, 18 years ago, as I often say, it was easier to get started working with the intelligence community than DoD. There was no front door for the sorts of technology new entrants. There was no DIU. There was no way of getting access to these problems. So In-Q-Tel was really that front door for the intelligence community. And as a consequence, we really started there. I think one of the changes that we have yet to see is really this deep internalization of, where do we believe in having a true monopsony and where do we want to rely on market forces? I think one of the ironies is that structurally, not philosophically, the DoD is the place that kind of believes in market capitalism the least. We have single concentrated buyers, no competition within the government. The government tends to focus on how competitive is the industrial base. That's an important question. But when you think about how do big companies actually run themselves, like how often are you financing multiple projects at the same time? Like competition as a dynamic to drive innovation, to spur urgency, it's a really important human factor. It goes beyond just simply a consequence of the markets. There are ways in which when you're the sole buyer of an aircraft carrier, it's a really hard job. I don't envy that job. You don't get to benefit from anyone else's amortized R&D. You don't get to, every sort of technology insertion rests on you. So I think finding ways to actually draft off innovation and the market forces is going to be critical to modernizing our approach to acquisition. I think that's the gap that's remaining. So Chris Brose kind of calls this the Moneyball military. There's another way of doing this. You're buying things where you're not looking to use them forever. You expect to replace them. You expect to have multiple entrants. You expect to have competition. And I think as we see with the kind of events unfolding in the world, a larger and larger part of the military can actually be serviced really well with this sort of approach. We've made huge progress, but I think the remaining progress is really about taking responsibility for the outcomes for these companies, which is a very uncomfortable place for the government to be, but it is the place it's always been in. When we needed to figure out titanium production, the government invested a lot in helping fund the underlying technologies that would pull through the companies to meet their ultimate needs around aerospace production and capabilities. Yeah, I think the reaction amongst, let's call it, new entrants in defense tech and the capital class, the VCs, has been overwhelmingly positive. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Like the work that we're doing by opening up our infrastructure shrinks the valley of death for these companies. It makes them more capital efficient. It gives them a better chance of surviving and driving the impact that they founded themselves to go do. The reaction with government is they're still trying to understand how does this completely help them. And I'd say it's more of a bifurcated response. So particularly people who have been with us for a while, they understand our infrastructure, not just our software. They understand how this is the easy path to bringing and creating a multi-vendor Big Tent ecosystem. Or in simple English, how do I leverage all of America's innovative companies and have the flexibility to swap in and out new capabilities? And then I think there's hardware-centric programs that are taking, it's a fundamental change in terms of how you think about this. It needs more education. Now, I'm very optimistic about that. Just today, the Army announced that they awarded us the Titan contract, which you can think of Titan as a ground station on wheels. We think of it as the first AI-defined vehicle. If Tesla made your car software-defined, we're making your weapon system AI-defined. And so you would typically think about, okay, well, what sort of company is going to deliver you a truck that is a ground station? You probably historically would not have thought of a software company. Tim Cook says, look, I don't make things in China because they're the cheapest. I make things in China because they're the best. Now, that wasn't true in the 90s. They were the cheapest. But as a consequence of 30 years of making things, they had the platform upon which to innovate. And as a consequence for us of having 30 years of not making things, we're left with hollow policy without an ability to translate. Our policy is not informed by the innovations that come from productivity. We produce a lot of software. We do, in fact, manufacture things. And now we've got to bring these things together. And I think this is why kind of almost priming the pump on reindustrialization is so important. Because even if it's not economic at time t equals 0, it's never going to get there unless you invest in that productivity that then drives innovation. I've been thinking a lot about kind of an orthogonal topic to this. Why did it actually work so, at the period in time, let's call it from the late 40s to the mid 70s, when the government really drove most of R&D and the government really did have access to technology first, what's kind of different about that period than the current period? And I think when the government was driving the creation of technology and its implementation, it had a much stronger footing to have opinions on policy and regulation of that technology, which is that we need to get rid of cost plus contracting. That actually, in a world where you're doing cost plus, you need the customer to believe what you're doing. The customer is essentially paying for your R&D. They're financing everything. It is pro-conformity, and it's going to weed out all the unconventional ideas. What you really want to do is shift the balance to a place where, no, you as the private citizen, as industry, put up your money. Go convince investors in this country that has the most dynamic, deepest capital markets. Go convince them that your approach has merit. Prove it to the government, and then sell it in a competitive way on a firm fixed price basis. Cost reasonableness is not based on a markup on your underlying costs, but based on what the alternatives are to the government. What value does this actually create? We would never run our American private markets through a cost plus mentality. We would do it through value. Oftentimes we're finding ourselves in a position where the government says, look, I don't want to pay for software. Software ought to be free. So I'm not even going to consider potential solutions that don't involve free software or open source software. And I think what we need to recognize is that actually open source is itself a business strategy. That strategy has come about to commoditize your complements. The simplest example is if you're an application software company or a database software company, there's only so much share of wallet at the customer. And so you're competing over the same dollars, essentially. Now, if you as application companies can come together and make an open source database that's free, that means you're going to shrink the share that goes to the database providers. You're going to increase the amount of wallet that's available to you.